The winter of 1945 bit deeper than any cold Clemens Farrell had ever known. At 26 years old, the German soldier stood among thousands of Wehrmacht prisoners in a frozen rail yard somewhere east of Berlin, his breath crystallizing in the air before him. The war was over. Germany had lost. But for Clemens and the other captured soldiers, a different kind of war was just beginning. The Soviet guards herded them into cattle cars with rifle butts and shouted commands. Clemens pressed against the wooden slats, trying to see out through the gaps as the train lurched forward. He caught glimpses of devastated landscapes, burned villages, and endless stretches of snow. Days turned into weeks. The train rolled east, always east, into the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. Men died standing up in those cars, frozen or starved, held upright by the press of bodies. Clemens learned to recognize death by the absence of breath clouds in the frigid air. He learned to fight for the corner positions where a man might sit, where survival was slightly more possible. He learned that hope was a luxury, but one he couldn't afford to abandon. When the train finally stopped, they were in Siberia, a word that had always sounded distant and unreal, like something from a fairy tale. But this was no tale. This was Cape Dezhnev, the easternmost point of Asia, where the Bering Straits separated the Soviet Union from Alaska. They were literally at the edge of the world. The labor camps sprawled across the tundra like a wound. Wooden watchtowers rose against the gray sky, and barbed wire stretched in every direction. The guards marched them through gates that seemed designed to swallow hope itself. Clemens was assigned number 5528. His name no longer mattered. His past no longer mattered. Only survival mattered now. The lead mine became Clemens's universe. Each day before dawn, the prisoners were roused from their barracks and counted. Then came the march to the mine entrance, a black hole carved into the frozen earth. Inside, the temperature was slightly warmer than outside, but the work was brutal. 12 hours of breaking rock, breathing dust, feeling the jarring impact of pickaxe on stone reverberate through bones already weakened by hunger. The rations were calculated with cruel precision, just enough to keep a man working, but never enough to build strength. Watery soup made from fish heads and grain. Black bread so hard it had to be soaked before eating. Sometimes, if a man was lucky, a piece of salted fish. Clemens watched his body transform, muscles melting away, ribs becoming more prominent. He was disappearing, becoming a ghost. But in that first year, Clemens learned. He learned which guards could be bribed with small favors, which ones enjoyed cruelty for its own sake. He learned to identify the prisoners who had given up. They would be dead within weeks, and those who still fought to survive. He learned that the human body could endure far more than anyone believed possible. He made two friends, a Russian doctor named Starobinsky, who had been imprisoned for political crimes, and a German officer named Heinz, who had survived Stalingrad before being captured. Together, they formed an alliance, sharing extra rations when they could, watching each other's backs, keeping each other's spirits from completely breaking. At night, lying on the wooden planks that served as beds, Clemens would think of home. He had a wife, Lucia, and 3 children he'd barely known. The youngest had been born just before he was deployed to the Eastern Front. Did they think he was dead? Had Lucia remarried? The thought should have pained him, but instead he hoped she had. Hoped that she was safe, that the children were fed and warm. That was enough. The camp commandant announced their sentences on a freezing October morning during the second year. 25 years of hard labor. The number was so absurd it almost made Clemens laugh. 25 years. He would be 51 when he was released, if he survived that long. Most prisoners didn't last 5 years. The mine, the cold, the hunger, the disease. They claimed almost everyone. That night, lying in the darkness, Clemens made his decision. He would escape. It was suicide. Everyone knew that. The camp was in the most remote location imaginable, thousands of miles from anything resembling civilization. The nearest city was hundreds of miles away. The taiga forest was an ocean of trees where a man could wander until he died of exposure or hunger. The wolves, the bears, the cold. They were all waiting to claim anyone foolish enough to run. But 25 years was a death sentence anyway. At least escape offered a chance, however slim. Clemens began his preparations with the patience of a man who understood that rushing meant death. He needed information first. In the camp, information was currency more valuable than food. He befriended a guard named Kamenev, who had a weakness for German pocket watches. Clemens had managed to hide his father's watch in a place so uncomfortable the Soviets hadn't found it during processing. He traded it for something priceless. Maps. Old, hand-drawn, barely legible maps that showed the region around the camp and the roads, if they could be called that, leading south and west. From Dr. Starobinsky, he learned about survival medicine, how to recognize frostbite before it became fatal, which plants in the taiga could be eaten, how to treat wounds with nothing but snow and torn cloth. The doctor had been in the camp for 7 years and had learned from other prisoners, accumulating knowledge like others hoarded bread crusts. Heinz, who had experience as a scout, taught him about navigation, how to use the stars when the sky was clear, how to read the landscape, to recognize north by the way moss grew on trees, how to estimate distances and pace himself for long marches. But beyond knowledge, Clemens needed supplies. This was the hardest part. Everything in the camp was counted, monitored, controlled. A missing blanket would trigger a search. Extra food would be noticed immediately. He worked for 8 months, stealing so slowly and so carefully that no single theft could be traced. A needle here, a length of wire there, scraps of cloth that could be layered for warmth. He fashioned crude boot liners from fabric torn from the inside of his mattress, where the missing material wouldn't be visible. He saved every scrap of food he could hide. Dried fish that wouldn't spoil, hard bread, even handfuls of grain from the feeding troughs. The most crucial supply was a knife. Clemens spent 3 months sharpening a piece of metal salvaged from the mine, working on it in the darkness of the barracks, using rocks to slowly create an edge. It wasn't much, but it was something. It could skin a rabbit, defend against a wolf, or cut through rope. He memorized the guard rotations, watching for patterns. He noted which guards were lazy, which were alert, which drank vodka during their shifts. He observed the fence, looking for places where the wire had rusted or where shadows offered concealment. The final element was timing. He needed to escape during summer when the temperatures were merely cold rather than lethal, but not too early in summer when the ground was muddy and travel would be slow, and he needed to time it to give himself the maximum head start before his absence was noticed. In June of 1949, 4 years after his capture, everything aligned. The night shift guard would be Petrov, who was known to sleep in the guard tower. There was a new moon, meaning maximum darkness. And most importantly, there was a supply truck scheduled to arrive the next day, which always caused chaos and distraction in the morning count. Clemens said goodbye to Dr. Starobinsky and Heinz without actually saying goodbye. They knew. They'd known for months what he was planning. Starobinsky pressed something into his hand, a small vial of iodine, worth its weight in gold. Heinz simply nodded and said, "Walk toward the sun." At 2:47 in the morning, Clemens slipped from his bunk. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might wake the other prisoners. But no one stirred. Months of planning came down to these next few minutes. He moved like water through the barracks, staying low, pausing at every creak of wood. At the door, he waited, listening. Outside, the camp was silent except for the eternal Siberian wind. He could see the guard tower, a dark shape against the stars. Petrov's silhouette was slumped, asleep or merely still. Clemens didn't wait to find out. He moved toward the fence at the pre-planned spot where a drainage ditch came close to the wire. He had his sharpened metal piece, and he'd watched this section of fence for months. 3 wires were rusted, weakened. He began cutting through the first one, working as silently as possible. The wire parted with a soft ping that sounded like a gunshot to Clemens's ears. He froze, waiting for shouts, searchlights, the crack of rifles. Nothing. He moved to the second wire. 10 minutes later, he was through. He crawled under the fence, feeling the cold mud soak through his clothes. Then he was on the other side, outside the camp for the first time in 4 years. Freedom was just meters away, and death was probably closer. He ran, not in the frantic, mindless sprint of a panicked animal, but in the measured, distance-eating pace that Heinz had taught him. He ran toward the tree line, toward the dark mass of forest that promised both concealment and 1,000 ways to die. Behind him, the camp receded into the darkness. No alarms, no shots. Either his escape hadn't been noticed yet, or Petrov was even more negligent than Clemens had hoped. The forest swallowed him whole. The Siberian taiga is the largest forest on Earth, a wilderness of pine and larch that stretches for thousands of miles. In summer, it's a maze of trees, swamps, and mosquitoes. In winter, it's a frozen hell. Clemens entered this world with nothing but the clothes on his back, his crude knife, a handful of supplies, and his memorized maps. The first 3 days were pure adrenaline. He moved south and west, using the sun to navigate. He knew that search parties would be after him, that dogs would be tracking his scent. So he walked through streams when he could, climbed over rocky ground that wouldn't hold footprints, and pushed himself to cover as much distance as possible before his body gave out. He collapsed on the third night beside a small stream, too exhausted to care about concealment or safety. His feet were bloody inside his boots. His body ached in ways he'd forgotten were possible. But when he woke at dawn to find no search party standing over him, no rifles pointed at his head, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The routine established itself over the following weeks. Walk from dawn until dusk, 15, sometimes 20 miles a day if the terrain allowed. Rest when his body demanded it. Eat whatever he could find: berries, roots, once a bird's nest with eggs. Drink from streams and pray the water wouldn't make him sick. The forest taught him lessons written in survival. He learned to recognize the sound of a stream before he saw it, crucial for finding water. He learned that the dense stands of trees often gave way to clearings where walking was easier. He learned to read the weather and the color of the sky, to sense approaching rain or storms. Hunger was his constant companion. The food he'd brought from the camp lasted less than a week. After that, he was foraging like a wild animal. He dug for roots, stripped bark from certain trees that he remembered Dr. Starabinsky mentioning. Once he found a patch of wild onions and ate until his stomach cramped. Another time, he discovered lingon berries and stuffed his pockets, knowing he might not find them again for days. The first time he successfully caught a fish with his hands in a shallow stream, he wept. The protein, the calories. It was almost too good to be true. He ate it raw, too afraid to light a fire that might be seen by search parties or attract attention from other humans. Because the greatest danger wasn't the forest itself, it was people. After 3 weeks of walking, Clemens emerged from the forest into farmland. In the distance, he could see a village, wooden houses with smoke rising from chimneys. His heart sank. Civilization meant danger. It meant questions he couldn't answer, authorities who would check papers he didn't have, the risk of being turned in for a reward. But it also meant food, real food. It meant information about how far he'd come and how far he still had to go. And his supplies were exhausted. He was starving, weakening daily. He needed to risk it. He circled the village, watching from the tree line. He noted the patterns when people moved about, when they didn't. He waited for night, then crept toward the outermost house, where a garden grew behind a simple fence. The vegetables were barely mature, but he didn't care. He pulled up potatoes, carrots, anything his hands found in the darkness. He was filling his pockets when a light appeared in the house window. He froze like a deer, heart pounding. A figure moved past the window, an old woman just checking something. The light disappeared. Clemens fled with his stolen food, back into the safety of the forest. He walked for another hour before stopping to catch his breath. Then he ate raw potato and carrot and felt like a king. Over the following months, this became his pattern. Walk through wilderness, avoid roads, and when desperation demanded it, steal from gardens at night. He became a ghost, a story that villagers might tell. Strange footprints in the garden, missing vegetables, the sense that someone was watching from the forest. Twice he encountered other people in the wilderness. The first time, it was a hunter who spotted him from across a clearing. Clemens ran, crashing through undergrowth, certain he would hear shots or shouts. But the hunter didn't pursue. Perhaps he thought Clemens was an escaped criminal, which technically was true, and decided that getting involved wasn't worth the trouble. The second encounter was more dangerous. Clemens had taken shelter in an abandoned hunting cabin during a storm. He woke to find two men standing over him with rifles. They spoke in Russian, asking questions he pretended not to understand. His German accent would give him away immediately. He'd prepared for this moment. He grabbed his crude knife and lunged, not at the men, but at the door. He burst outside into the rain and ran. Shots cracked behind him, but the storm and darkness worked in his favor. He lost them in the forest and didn't stop running until dawn. After that, he avoided all structures, all signs of human habitation. Better to freeze in the open than be captured in a cabin. By August, Clemens had crossed into what he believed was the region near Lake Baikal. The terrain had changed from flat taiga to rolling hills, and now in the distance, he could see mountains. His memorized maps suggested these were the beginning of the mountain ranges that separated Siberia from Mongolia and Central Asia. Mountains meant new challenges. The easy walking of the flatlands was gone. Now each day involved climbing steep slopes, navigating rocky terrain that shredded his makeshift boots, and dealing with thin air that left him gasping. But mountains also meant he was making progress. He was moving south and west, away from the camp, towards something that might eventually resemble freedom. The nights were getting colder. Summer was ending, and Clemens realized with creeping horror that he wouldn't make it out of Siberia before winter. The thought was almost paralyzing. He'd survived one Siberian winter, in the camp, barely. But at least their heat had walls and a roof, however inadequate. Out here, winter would be a death sentence, unless he found shelter. He began looking for caves, for anything that might offer protection. In a rocky outcropping, he finally found what he needed. A shallow cave, barely deep enough to lie down in, but with an overhang that would block wind and snow. It wasn't much, but it might keep him alive. The decision was agonizing. Stop now and wait out the winter, losing precious time, or push forward and likely die in a storm. He stopped. He had to. His body was giving out, weakened by months of starvation and constant exertion. He needed to rest, to heal, to prepare for the next leg of the journey. The cave became home. Clemens spent the autumn preparing for winter with the focus of someone who understood that every detail might mean the difference between life and death. He gathered firewood, stacking it deep in the cave where it would stay dry. He caught and dried fish from a nearby stream. He made snares from stolen wire and caught rabbits, smoking the meat over small fires. He improved his clothing, layering stolen fabric and animal skins into something that might actually provide warmth. He created a makeshift sleeping bag from pine boughs and layered materials. He even attempted to make a calendar, scratching marks on the cave wall to track the days. When the first snow fell in October, Clemens was as ready as he could be. The cave was stocked, his clothes were as warm as he could make them, and he had a plan: survive until spring. But Siberian winter tested him in ways he hadn't imagined. The temperatures dropped so low that his breath froze on his beard. The wind howled like a living thing, trying to find its way into every gap in his clothing. The snow piled so high that some days he couldn't leave the cave at all. He rationed his food with painful precision: a piece of dried fish, a handful of pine nuts, water melted from snow. Never enough to feel satisfied, just enough to keep death at bay one more day. The loneliness was almost worse than the physical hardship. In the camp, there had been other people, the sense of shared suffering. Here there was only silence and cold and the constant whisper of doubt. What if the maps were wrong? What if he was traveling in circles? What if his family was dead and this entire journey was for nothing? On the darkest days, Clemens would recite his children's names: Hans, Greta, little Clemens, who he'd never even held. He would imagine their faces, though the memories were fading like old photographs. He would tell himself stories about what he would do when he got home, how he would hold Lucia, how he would play with the children, how he would never take warmth or food or safety for granted again. Christmas came and went, marked only by a scratch on the cave wall. Clemens sang a carol to himself, his voice cracking and strange after months of disuse. Then he ate his ration and went back to waiting. January was the worst. The cold reached depths that seemed physically impossible. Clemens would wake in the night, shaking uncontrollably, certain he would die before morning. He kept a small fire going constantly, burning through his wood supply faster than he'd planned. But without it, he would freeze. February brought slightly warmer days, though warmer was relative, still well below freezing, but survivable. Clemens began to believe he might actually make it. In March, the snow began to melt. Water dripped from the cave entrance. Birds appeared, singing songs that sounded like messages from another world. Spring was coming, life was returning to the taiga, and Clemens would walk again. When Clemens finally left the cave in April of 1950, he looked like a wild man from legend. His hair and beard were long and matted. His clothes were patchwork rags held together by wire and hope. His body was skeletal, ribs showing clearly through his skin. But he was alive. He spent the first week just recovering his strength, eating everything he could find. The spring forest was bursting with life: new shoots, bird eggs, fish running in the streams. After the starvation of winter, it felt like paradise. Then he continued walking. South and west, always south and west. The terrain gradually changed as the weeks passed. The dense taiga began to thin. The mountains gave way to steppes, vast grasslands that stretched to the horizon. He was leaving Siberia behind. In late May, he reached a large river, According to his mental map, this might be the Yenisei River, which meant he'd traveled roughly 600 miles from the camp, more than halfway to what he hoped was his destination, Iran, where he'd heard there was a British consulate that might help a German soldier trying to get home. But the river was too wide and too fast to swim. He spent 3 days walking along the bank, looking for a crossing point. Finally, he found a village with a ferry, a simple wooden platform pulled by ropes. The risk was enormous. To use the ferry meant being seen, asking questions, potentially being recognized as an escaped prisoner. But there was no other way across. Clemens waited until the ferry operator was an old man who looked half-blind. He approached slowly, hands visible, trying to appear harmless. He mumbled something in broken Russian about needing to reach family. The old man squinted at him, shrugged, and gestured to the ferry. The crossing took 15 minutes. 15 minutes of standing in the open, visible to anyone who might be watching. Clemens kept his head down, his heart hammering. When they reached the other side, he paid with a small piece of metal he'd been saving. Worthless, but shiny enough that the old man accepted it. Then he was across, disappearing into the landscape before anyone could question him further. The months blurred together in a haze of walking. June, July, August. Clemens measured time by the changing landscape in the position of the sun. The steppes gave way to desert. The cold of Siberia was replaced by scorching heat. Now, instead of freezing at night, he baked during the day. New challenges emerged. Water became scarce. He learned to recognize signs of wells and springs, to follow animal tracks that might lead to water sources. He learned to walk at night when it was cooler and rest during the brutal midday heat. He crossed into Kazakhstan, though he didn't know it at the time. All he knew was that the villages looked different now. The people dressed differently, spoke languages he didn't recognize. He was in Central Asia, a world away from Germany. His clothes disintegrated and were replaced by stolen items from laundry lines. His boots finally gave out completely, and he fashioned crude sandals from bark and cord. He looked nothing like a German soldier anymore. He looked like a beggar, a wanderer, someone who existed on the margins of society. And he kept walking. By September, he estimated he'd traveled nearly 1,000 miles. The journey that should have killed him 10 times over continued. He'd survived winter cold and summer heat, hunger and thirst, wild animals and wild humans. He'd walked through forests, over mountains, across deserts. But he wasn't safe yet. Iran was still hundreds of miles away, and the Soviet Union still wanted him back. In October of 1950, more than a year after his escape, Clemens reached the Soviet-Iranian border. He didn't know the exact location. Borders in this region were fluid, unmarked, patrolled irregularly. But the geography had changed in ways that matched his mental maps. The Caspian Sea was to his west. The Elburz Mountains rose to the south. He was close. So close he could taste it. But crossing an international border meant guard posts, patrols, questions, papers that he didn't have, a foreign face that would draw attention. If he was caught now, after everything he'd survived, it would break him. He waited and watched for 3 days, observing the patterns of the border guards. They moved in predictable routes, checking the main roads and known crossing points. But between the official crossings, there were gaps. Miles of wilderness where a single man might slip through unnoticed. On the 4th night, with no moon and thick clouds obscuring the stars, Clemens made his move. He walked across an invisible line in the desert, from the Soviet Union into Iran, from captivity into freedom. He didn't feel the moment. There was no sign, no marker. But he knew. The air felt different. The very ground felt different. He was out. He walked another 5 miles before collapsing in exhaustion. When he woke at dawn, he looked back toward the north, toward Siberia, toward the camp where 5,000 other prisoners were still breaking rocks in the mine. He thought of Dr. Starobinsky and Heinz. He thought of all the men who hadn't made it, who were buried in unmarked graves in the permafrost. Then he turned south and kept walking. The British consulate in Tehran seemed like a mirage when Clemens first saw it. A white building with a flag, guarded by men in uniform. Civilization, authority, the possibility of help. He approached the gate like a beggar, because that's what he looked like. The guards initially tried to wave him away. He spoke in German, then tried his broken English. "Please, I am German soldier. I escaped from Siberia. Please help." The guards exchanged glances. This was clearly not a normal situation. One of them went inside. Minutes passed. Then a British officer emerged, looking skeptical but curious. "You say you escaped from Siberia?" the officer asked in accented German. "Yes, sir. From camp near Cape Desnev. I walked for 15 months, 1,000 miles, maybe more." The officer's skepticism deepened. "That's impossible. No one could survive such a journey." Clemens simply nodded. "I understand, but it is true." They took him inside. They gave him food, water, clean clothes. They questioned him extensively, clearly trying to determine if he was a Soviet spy or crazy or telling the truth. Clemens answered every question, providing details about the camp, the journey, the route he'd taken. He showed them his feet, scarred, deformed by frostbite and thousands of miles of walking. He showed them his body, emaciated, covered in scars and wounds. Slowly, the British began to believe him. It took weeks to arrange, but eventually they secured him passage back to West Germany. Back to a country that had been divided, conquered, rebuilt into something new during his years away. Clemens Farrell arrived in West Germany in December 1950, 5.5 years after being captured. He weighed barely 100 pounds. His hair had gone white. He looked like an old man, though he was only 31. The Red Cross helped him locate his family. Lucia was alive. She was living in a small apartment in Munich with the 3 children. She had received a letter years ago saying her husband was missing and presumed dead. She had mourned him. She had moved on with her life as best she could. The knock on her door that winter morning seemed ordinary, but when she opened it, she found a ghost standing there. "Lucia," Clemens said, "it's me." She stared at him, this skeletal stranger with white hair and haunted eyes. Then she saw something in his face, some echo of the man she'd married. Her hand went to her mouth. "Clemens," she whispered. "Clemens." He nodded, unable to speak through the tears. She pulled him inside, holding him as if he might disappear if she let go. The children, now 8, 6, and 5, stared at this stranger their mother was crying over. Little Clemens, who had never known his father, hid behind his mother's skirts. "It's your papa," Lucia told him. "Your papa came home." It took time, months of healing, physically and emotionally. The nightmares didn't stop. The instinct to hoard food, to always know where the exits were, to wake at the slightest sound, these things never fully went away. But he was home. He was free. He had walked 1,000 miles through hell and survived. Years later, Clemens would write about his journey, trying to make sense of what he'd endured. People would read his story and question whether it was possible, whether any human could do what he claimed to have done. Some would call him a liar. Others would call him a hero. But those labels didn't matter to Clemens. What mattered was sitting at the dinner table with his family, feeling warm, having enough to eat. What mattered was watching his children grow up, seeing them become adults, meeting his grandchildren. What mattered was that he had refused to give up, that when faced with an impossible choice, die slowly in the camps or die quickly trying to escape, he had chosen to fight, to walk, to survive one more day, and then another, until those days became months and those months became one of the most remarkable journeys in human history. The German soldier who walked 1,000 miles to escape Siberia became a husband again, a father again, a human being again. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. This story is inspired by the true account of Cornelius Rost, the real name of the man called Clemens Farrell, in Joseph Martin Bauer's book, As Far as My Feet Will Carry Me. While the core journey actually happened, some details have been dramatized for narrative purposes. Rost was a German soldier captured by the Soviets in 1945, sentenced to 25 years in a labor camp near the Bering Strait, and escaped in 1949. His walk across Siberia, Kazakhstan, and into Iran remains one of the most extraordinary survival stories of the 20th century. He was reunited with his family in West Germany in 1952 after 7 years away. He lived until 1983, carrying the physical and psychological scars of his journey until the end.